Weighing in on the issues which I perceive Gran Turismo 7, or pretty much any Gran Turismo game, as having has always been something which I do on the channel, and for this one I wanted to make it a little bit different. See, as I'll have probably put in the thumbnail, maybe even in the title, this is part 1 of 2, and the reason for that is because I want to actually make part 2 by the community. So instead of just me talking about this, I want to actually feature some of the most common issues that I see you folks posting down in the comments, some of which we've doubtless talked about before, and many might be more niche, but may be worth mentioning at the same time as well. So for me there are 5, and I'm not going to get super in depth into any of them because many of these I have talked about before. Some of you may agree on these, and of course you could put that in the comments anyway, or maybe if there is some additional points or maybe some alternative angles within these same issues, absolutely put that down below. And then for part 2 I'm going to feature many of those. Number 1 is something which I'm going to call the mismatched theme of the game. And to me this is much more of an issue with GT7 than it is with GT Sport. See, GT Sport, although many of us were hoping for a logical next step in the Gran Turismo experience, the name was different. It immediately set itself apart as different in terms of the career mode, etc. And of course the much more overt leaning toward the online mode, as again the name suggested, of GT Sport, even though we didn't really know what that meant at the time, etc. With GT7 though, even in the marketing, you can clearly see that the game was trying to appeal to the more nostalgic side, to those of us who do prefer the older experience, and of course that was very deliberate. Having stuff like the Castrol Supras and Pennzoil Skylines and Alpha 155s featured predominantly with newer vehicles like the Mono in those trailers, the 911 GT1, Carrera GT, etc. Tracks like Deep Forest and Trial Mountain were featured, all of this stuff playing on the member berry, so clearly they were trying to at least insinuate this more traditional experience, and even aspects of the game within it have a very throwback vibe, with the map style home menu very Gran Turismo 4 or 3-esque, the career mode which is in some ways almost attempting to have more of a traditional experience but doesn't quite get there necessarily in terms of the cafe menu. The missions, for example, the licenses, they do manage to have some of that older vibe, but then you have parts of the game which really don't, such as, for example, how many of the vehicles don't feel entirely necessary. There are certain entire categories of vehicle which really don't have anything to do with them, such as electric cars. We have more and more of them added here and there, like the Tesla and the Volkswagen IDR, but even then you can't really use them for that much. And of course this is where we get to the mismatch, because even though it's not GT Sport 2, it still has a definite leaning towards sport mode, at least as much as career mode, if not more so. If you look at the amount of kind of aftercare, if you will, after sales support of the game, the majority of the effort that goes into it is between 2 things: monthly updates, or semi-monthly, however often they end up being, and of course the live events, esports, the changing daily races, weekly races, challenges, time trials, etc. Well, if you really look at it, the time trials and stuff, those online aspects, the esports aspects, they're updated much more regularly, and of course live events are given far more pomp and ceremony than any update ever will be. Now part of that is because it lends itself to being more pomp and ceremony, but still that is definitely more of a GT Sport style thing. So to me it feels like the game is trying to be both, but the problem is when you try to do 2 things, you can't always fully commit to either. And for me, that's where the mismatched theme of the game comes in. To me, having 2 separate games would actually be more ideal than this. And even though, of course, for some logistical reasons that might not be possible, they have, let's not forget, done that before. They released the PSP game, for example, while they were still working on other games, and they released Tourist Trophy, an entirely different game with a totally different career structure, etc., at the same time. So they've shown that they can do it before. With the higher level of effort required for games now, it would be more of a challenge, but this is Polyphony we're talking about. They were leaders in this, so of course if they wanted to still be leading the charge and having multiple titles at the same time, I'm sure they could. Number 2 for me is going to be more of a controversial one, and this is what I'm going to call held back content, but in parentheses, for no good reason. There are certain vehicles which we already knew were ready. There are certain vehicles which, thanks to the leaked data mining list, for example, we knew were planned, if not completed, from day one. if not before, and sometimes you'll see in, for example, again, the previous games, certain cars, such as, for example, the Lotus 97T, which of course was Senna's Formula car in Gran Turismo 6, was featured in trailers before it was ever in the game. And I don't just mean like a trailer for that update, I mean it was featured in like day one trailers, and I believe even certain tracks were featured in trailers that were not in the game from day one. I seem to recall Le Mans, for example, being one of those, and of course that arrived later in an update, but this is my issue. I have no fundamental problem with DLC, as long as it adds to the game. That's why, for example, I love the DLC in Fallout 4. It's entirely new multiple sections of the game, such as Far Harbor or Nuka World. In Gran Turismo it doesn't feel like DLC. It feels like something which they just held back for the sake of a fake feeling that something new has been delivered. And although in some cases I do believe that those things are quote-unquote new, such as, for example, I'm sure some of the cars that were, let's say, not featured in the data mining list, like your Volkswagen IDR, perhaps some others, I could see those being genuine later additions, but some of them I just don't buy it. Tracks, for example, must take a lot longer than cars, so I don't believe that they add all of the tracks posthumously without having at least some ready to go beforehand as well. Likewise for Gran Turismo Sport, I don't believe that for a second, that all of that stuff is made after the fact. So again, the issue is not that they add content, that's fine. I'm fine with paying for content as long as it feels justified, and if the packs were like 10, 20 cars and a couple of circuits, but it's not that. It feels forced, it feels fake, and it feels drawn out, and sometimes it clearly is drawn out. Number 3. This is definitely more of a sport mode thing, and as any who watched my Road to Platinum series recently, which I believe was a 5-part series wherein I wanted to complete the last achievement in the game, which was just to have the 50 sport mode events, I of course saw a few examples of what many have been criticising GT Sport and 7 for. I'm sure it happened in 6 as well, but I don't recall hearing about it as much then, with regard to penalties. Just in general, how the game seems to have this very cut and dried, analytical, almost YouTube algorithm kind of approach without really factoring in, well, the human element that a machine, at the moment at least, can't really do. Unless you have some kind of advanced AI which is going to try and interpret what you meant by something. So if you intended to, for example, brake check someone, or on the other hand, if you just didn't check your mirror properly, those kind of things do require finesse. It's why, for example, a live esports event, you can have a judge if you wanted to, and that judge could look at each player's feed, do the playback, see if the player had in fact, for example, looked behind in the mirror, or could see if the person was coming up behind them and if it was a genuine mistake, etc, etc. So to me, the penalties definitely lack finesse. They feel too cut and dried, and sometimes, especially in that series that I did, the Road to Platinum, some of the penalties were just utterly insane. One of them in particular on Dragon Trail, where a car bounced off of a wall into my car, but I ended up getting the penalty for no apparent reason, and we all have stories about that if we've raced in sport mode. It's just ridiculous, and again, this is not really something that seems to have been proved that much, if at all, over the previous game, despite the fact that literally years have passed, and even though they've put a lot of time into the Sophie AI, which is great, again, that kind of harkens back to point number 1. They put this effort into Sophie, which is much more of a solo career kind of asset, but then for the sport mode, which they seem to favour, the penalties have not received the same kind of advanced updates in terms of maybe using AI or whatever else. Again, it's kind of a mismatch of priorities. This one ties into something which I said earlier on, and it's more specifically what I will call not enough value for specific cars and tracks. What I mean by not enough value goes back to what I said about the electric cars. There are entire swaths of vehicles in this game which feel like they're completely unnecessary. For a recent example, the Renault 4. Many people didn't like that car. They feel like it's too slow, it's too useless, and aside from maybe an engine swap, they'll probably never use it, or never use it again at least. For many people, the Vision GT cars broadly fall into that camp, aside from maybe 1 or 2, like a Tomahawk. Those are fair enough because the way the games are structured, they kind of do lead to that. Electric cars are, for the most part, useless. Those Vision GTs are usually either way too high on points, or the fact that you can't tune them means that you're pretty much locked into whether or not it's already a good car. Then you have certain tracks. I know back in day 1, for example, many people were really annoyed by how many months kept going by with no meaningful updates to Monza in terms of career mode events, and even now there are certain tracks in the game which don't really have a wide variety of things to do. Certainly in terms of events that you'd want to either go back to or even find find any real value in the first place. Classic cars, modern cars, tuners, supercharged, turbo, whatever else, they have these elements, but something about it just doesn't have the same vibe as the older games. Again, that's very subjective, but once again, that's the whole point of this video. The final one is one which I'm definitely not going to talk about too much, because it's one which I've talked about at length, and that is lack of communication. This, of course, like number one, is much more of a broad thing, and I think many of us agree on this point already. Some of us may even agree without even knowing it. Polyphony just doesn't really talk to us. They, for example, release teasers a couple of days before the trailer drops. The trailer itself usually drops literally the night before the update drops, sometimes the same morning. I mean, what's the point of it at that point? You're not generating any kind of hype, because people who are going to play it already are. And even just in general, there's just not much discourse around the game. And even though some have tried to excuse that, or excuse Polyphony in general for usually one of two things, either the disasters in Japan, which is fair enough, but again, this is much more than just a GT7 thing, it's always been an issue for Polyphony, and secondarily, the Japanese culture being different, I'm sure, is something which is a factor, but even then, there are other Japanese companies who have better communication, and even if it's a culture thing, you can still learn from other cultures. It's a way to legitimately improve yourself without really changing that much, because to communicate more with their own community, well, let's be honest, it's not exactly like it takes that much effort. You literally just talk. That's all we would ask, even if it was just Kaz taking a short amount of time, or somebody who Kaz trusts to take some time out of their day and just address the community on Twitter, maybe on the Gran Turismo YouTube channel in a live stream or something. This is not big stuff that we're talking about. Here's the when, here's the what, and here's the why. Not just, oh, here, you have something now, and then just dead quiet again until the next thing arrives. So for me, that's definitely the easiest out of all of these points to address, but whether or not they will, well, looking at their track record, probably not. Kaz does occasionally do interviews where certain things get answered, but they tend to be very broad questions like, will we ever get a tourist trophy too? And as cool as it is to hear those answered, they don't really give us much about the here and now, more often than not. Ultimately though, that's the 5 issues which I believe Gran Turismo 7 needs to address. I'm sure if I thought about it for ages and ages, I could come up with more, maybe some picky ones, maybe some broader ones, but I wanted to leave it more open for you folks as well. Like I said, I will be doing a part 2. I'm going to take a look through the comments, see if there are any which get mentioned by multiple people or upvoted a number of times, so be sure to read other people's stuff as well. Even if you don't want to write your own comment, absolutely check out other people. You might see something that you agree with and give it a like, and of course we will reconvene for part 2 and see what you think in addition to mine, or maybe seconding thoughts that I've had here. That's it though for this video. I'll see you next time for part 2, and for now, thanks for watching.